Përshëndetje të nderuar shikues të Radio Televizionit të Kosovës. Siç dihet, njëri nga mbështetësit më të mëdhenj të pavarësisë së Kosovës dhe shtetëndërtimit kanë qenë Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës. Këtu në studiot në Washington të Voice of America të ftuar kam njohësin e çështjeve të Ballkanit, zotin Jim Hooper, i cili aktualisht udhëheq me një think tank këtu në Washington. Mr. Hooper, welcome to RTK.
Thank you very much, Melinda.
You were quite involved in Balkan issues, particularly in Kosovo issues, in crucial processes, starting from the war in Kosovo. What has linked you as an American with small countries such as Kosovo?
You know, it's a good question, Melinda, and I'm happy to speak about it. It's always struck me, I respected what the Kosovars were doing from the beginning, from the time I began working on the issue, actually in 1989 when I was in the State Department. And it was just so incredible to me that to follow the issue over the years, to get to meet a number of Kosovars, both from Kosovo and also in the Albanian American community. And I really got to like them, and I got to respect them as people, as individuals, not just people with an issue and who come in to talk about it. And it was a very meaningful experience for me. And more, I began to appreciate, particularly on the eve of the war, when the Kosovars were suffering so much from the occupation at that time, the Serbian occupation, and I understood that, suffering more than a lot of others. And one's heart goes out to that kind of situation because they began fighting back. They had their own underground education system. They didn't just sit there passively and complain about the fate that God had visited upon them. They really took it into their own hands. And the Kosovo Liberation Army arose, and right away the Americans began trying to negotiate something, a deal, an understanding with Slobodan Milosevic. Of course, this was not likely to be successful given what had already happened in Bosnia. But nonetheless, the late Ambassador Holbrooke continued to say, and people that worked with him continued to say, that the United States and NATO are not going to be the Air Force for the KLA. We are not going to be the Air Force for the KLA. We are not going to be the Air Force for the KLA. And CNN would often invite me, as well as VOA, of course, but would often invite me down to speak because I continued to say that ultimately the United States would have to be the Air Force for the KLA because NATO's, America's power, purpose, and resolve and the future of NATO were at stake in this. And it was extraordinary when the United States became the Air Force for the KLA during the war. Now, I always understood every day when I came into work that I was sitting in an office or at home in Washington, and there were people out there who were dying in Kosovo. Hundreds of thousands of people were pouring across the border. They'd been driven into Macedonia, into Albania. It was an extraordinary World War II kind of scene. And I worked actually informally with General Clark's office to help him before that and during the war, and did as much as I could, spoke on the media as much as I could, and the war was won, and this was extraordinary. And then after the war, international aid officials told the refugees who were in Macedonia and Albania, wait till we demine everything. And it was, and they didn't listen. They just started pouring back home. They wanted to go back to their homes. And this time it was going to be different because the Serbs would not be there. And again, it was a very deeply moving experience for me to see that, to people that I cared about a lot, that they just once again took their own fate into their hands and they changed it into their destiny and they began making their future. And if you will allow me to say so, the experience that I don't think I've ever said this before, at least in an interview, that I would like to thank the people of Kosovo for what, if I may, for what you have given to me, for what they have given to me. But I'm speaking to the people of Kosovo. I put in a lot of work on behalf of this cause and on behalf of their independence and their freedom and their future. And I continue to work on that. I care a lot about the issue. but I have gotten so much more back from the Kosovar people from my experience as being a founding board member of the American University in Kosovo, but just everything, the friends I've made are really life friends. They're not just friends of a few years. They're people I want to keep in touch with for the rest of my life. I'm always happy when I visit, and it's been such a meaningful experience for me, and I really want to thank the people of Kosovo for everything that they have given to me.
As I'm aware, you were in Rambouillet when the process, when the agreement on peace was going on in there, and there were lots of debates during that period of time, and the process was quite close. So there were not like enough information linked from that. Was there any specific discussion or any unwritten agreement reached in there, and the public was not aware until today?
I wasn't actually at Rambouillet, but I was working on Rambouillet back in Washington. My partner at Paul Williams was the president of Public International Law and Policy Group. I'm managing director. He was there at Rambouillet. And I think it was really, the expectation was that the Americans wanted, they knew that there was not going to be an agreement, or they would have been happy if there was, but they didn't expect there to be an agreement. Holbrooke very much wanted an agreement, but I think he was pretty skeptical it was going to happen. There was no way Milosevic was going to sign this agreement. What this was intended as was to get the Kosovars to sign this agreement, including the KLA, because Mr. Thaci, now the prime minister, but then he was the political leader of the KLA, was there among the representatives for the KLA there. And the idea was that it would be signed, and then and Milosevic would not, and that would lead to airstrikes in the beginning of a NATO campaign, because it was clear that Serbia was increasing its repression and driving people out, and so the situation was getting worse. And I think people were, it took a little while to sort that out, but there's not anything that I'm aware of. The only story that perhaps hasn't been told, and this may have been told, was Holbrooke kept the text of the agreement from General Wesley Clark, the NATO Supreme Commander, because I was writing something as it was going through the drafting, and I wrote something, an op-ed or whatever, in which I referred to the documents, which I had a copy of. And I got a call from his office asking how did I know this? And I said, well, I had a copy. And they said, I was told, well, by his political advisor, by Clark's political advisor, who I knew from the State Department, said, well, we haven't gotten a text by Holbrooke. Could you send us your copy? So I sent him a copy of the text, and that's how he got the text of what they were negotiating there. I'm not aware that that's been told, but perhaps it was in General Clark's book or someone's book.
Was there any specific reason why Holbrooke was keeping the agreement? I mean, not.
He liked to control the negotiations, and he didn't like to share information, and he did not want there to be. He did not want the United States to go to war over Kosovo. I think that's fair to say. He did everything possible to prevent that war from happening, and I think General Clark saw that the NATO Supreme Commander saw that war was inevitable, and he wanted to be prepared. And I think that Holbrooke just did not want to give him any more ammunition, if that's the correct word, and cut him out of this kind of information.
In your opinion, I'm going to turn back, since we are talking about the period of war, and just after the NATO troops landed in Kosovo, we know that most of the Serbs have moved, and some of them were concentrated in the north, and at some point we can say that the north was divided just after the war ended in Kosovo, just after the NATO troops landed in Kosovo, and since then it became the biggest problem for Kosovo. What do you think? Was also the international community aware that this problem will go and arrive into this point, which is quite difficult now to fix as a problem?
I think the problem does go back to the reaction and the policies of the internationals during that period. They never really established a rule of law in the north of the Ibar, the way they did in the south. They really treated it differently. It was a de facto, of course, officially they accepted that Pristina had sovereignty over the north. But de facto, they allowed the Serbs to really run that as if it was a part of Serbia. And therefore, it became almost impossible for the authorities in Pristina to establish their authority over the north. Now, the Serbs of the north are different than the Serbs of the south. I think in the south, they have gone much further toward integrating themselves into Kosovar society, to being good citizens of Kosovo. Obviously, they wish that this was not the situation. They would be happier, of course, if it was a part of Serbia, but they know that the South is never going to become part of Serbia again. The North, they believe they are part of Serbia, and they are used to getting their way with the authorities in the North. They have a moral authority in their kind of warped outlook on life in the North. And they see this as their territory. They want nothing to do with Pristina. And it's been a very difficult negotiation and then implementation of the Brussels agreement that was achieved almost exactly a year ago, in April of last year. And so that's a continuing problem. I don't see, I think it's now better. The situation is better for two reasons. One, the international community has really strengthened their recognition of Pristina's authority over the north. Secondly, the idea of a partition, I think, has really dropped. That's gone by the wayside. That's no longer a viable alternative because partition would mean that all of the Serbs south of the Ibar would flee. If you had a territorial exchange with the Preševo Valley, that kind of thing. It would be easy to negotiate with Belgrade. I don't think there would be any problem with that, but it would be probably a disaster in terms of stability for Kosovo, for Macedonia, for the region. It would set off a chain of events that would be very difficult to contain. And so I think wisely, the government in Pristina has turned this down, has rejected this, very firmly rejected this, and I think that's completely off the table. But I give credit to the progressives in Serbia. They are different. I understand that people view Mr. Nikolic as someone who has a particular view, shall we say. They judge him by the past, by his affinity toward Russia, and some of the positions he took in the past. I think he's actually outgrown much of this. But Mr. Dacic, and especially he's a socialist, but Mr. Vucic really have shed old ways of thinking. And I believe they have a vision for Serbia, a vision of Serbia as part of the West, part of the transatlantic community. And they do not want continuing problems with Kosovo. They do not want the Serbs in the north to continually leverage their own views and make Kosovo the most important issue for Serbia. I think they really do want to get on with economic reforms. They now have a majority government. And actually, I think that's a good thing for Kosovo. What it means is, so this is a long way of answering your question about the north, but you can't answer the question of the north without referring to Serbia. And Kosovo is a small country. It defeated it had its own army. It defeated, with the help of NATO, Serbia during the war. There was a real ground force for the United States to partner with. They won that international court case on their independence. They got their independence. They just keep moving. They got the dialogue with the North. So you have a government that keeps moving forward in Pristina. And I think that's really extraordinary. If you have a government, and again, I believe that a government cannot only focus on foreign affairs. It has to make sure that the streets are kept clean and the schools are functioning and the garbage is picked up and all of these services. They're very, very important. But Kosovo is a small country. It cannot survive on its own in the very dangerous environment in which it lives. It needs the support of the United States and the sympathy of the United States and the international community. That means you have to have a vision. Kosovo needs a government that has a vision, that is international, and that is willing to push the envelope, willing to move things forward. So again, Kosovo cannot survive for long without a government that has a vision.
Did we have a government who has a vision until now?
I understand that, I believe that this government does. Now, I understand the problems, and it's not a, I think probably many in this government would be the first to acknowledge that they have not done things to the best that they could, that there's a need for more change, and you know, I understand that. This is an election season, so I'm not trying to urge anyone to vote for or against any political party here in Kosovo. But all I'm saying is that in this election, that their vote in about 10 days, their vote is going to be very important. And you need to take into account the vision of the people that you are voting for. Do they have the ability to maintain a constructive and even more than constructive, a positive relationship with the West and with the United States and Europe? And also, I think you need to have a government that has a forward-looking, positive policy towards Serbia. And again, I really do understand this from the heart. I understand what they went through, but it cannot always be about the past. It has to be about the future. And people need to have a hope, and a reasonable hope, based on something concrete, that the relationship with Serbia is not always so tenuous, that war is looming around the corner or any of this, because that just creates a situation where you don't get investors, where people are making decisions that are on the basis of a looming war or this kind of thing, or there's violence and fighting, and it just begins to create a downward spiral, a dynamic like that. There needs to be a vision, a positive vision of a relationship of some sort, a constructive relationship with Serbia.
You were, in one of your reports that I have read, you were quite skeptical that the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia will will be successful, and you were skeptical on the European Union's on this issue, that they are more into continuing with status quo with the North rather than to fix that problem. And the report was like 2 years ago. Could you explain why you were skeptical toward the role of European Union in dialogue with Kosovo and Serbia?
My concern was whether the European Union would, their preference, if they had a preference, would be to bring Serbia into the EU and put Kosovo on a track that did not lead to immediate membership, shall we say, that lengthened the period. And one might even look at it more darkly. But my concern was that the EU would not be tough enough, that they would not insist on Serbia implementing the agreement according to its terms, because with Serbia you have to negotiate twice. First to get them to agree, and then to get them to implement. Now, I think the Kosovars are pretty good about negotiating. They're tough negotiators, and that the reason for that is because they plan to implement the agreement. And the internationals are always pretty insistent on looking over the shoulder of the Kosovars to make sure that they're implementing it. But they're, shall we say, more relaxed sometimes about Serbian implementation. Yet the only way that the Serbs are going to change and are going to reform is if the EU insists and the United States insists that they maintain high standards. Those who want change in Serbia, who want a better relationship with the EU, and who understand that that requires domestic reforms, would actually prefer strong pressure from Brussels and from the EU, and actually from Germany in a way, because Germany's obviously the heavyweight in Europe. So you know, that is, for them, that is useful to have that, because that enables them to move reforms forward in Serbia. So my concern was that I was just not certain that the EU would follow through if an agreement was reached.
We can consider that there was modest progress on the North on the implementation of the agreement, but still we know that the security situation there remains fragile, and also building of the institution and so on hasn't reached its aim. So do you consider that European Union should make more pressure, So the Serbian authorities will be willing to implement it completely, the agreement in the north, because as you said, Kosovo institutions were ready to implement all the agreements which were reached in Brussels, but the same didn't happen in from the Serbian part.
I think Brussels has to be, again, I want to be fair. I believe that I take the progressives seriously, and I believe that they are ahead of their reputation. Even now, they're ahead of their reputation, though people have begun to accept that they are a lot better than their reputation had been in the past. But they need pressure, helpful pressure, but nonetheless pressure from Brussels. They need care and attention. They need a lot of attention from Brussels in order to, for them to move forward on implementing the deal as the deal was negotiated. And so it is to the advantage of the deal, it is to the advantage of the Kosovars and the Serbs that Brussels continues to monitor this very closely and to be insistent that both Kosovo and Serbia carry out the terms of the agreement as agreed.
Let's go to another issue important for Kosovo. As you know, Kosovo previous parliamentarians have approved a document which obligates Kosovo to establish a tribunal for the war crimes, which will investigate only the KLA troops. What is your comment on this?
I believe, let's say I understand that there is a lot of skepticism about this, perhaps hostility in Kosovo, but all I can say to the Kosovar people is, it has to be done. The future of their relationship with the West is to some extent going to ride on the outcome, going to hinge on the outcome of this. The Kosovars, as unfair as they believe it may be, they have to go along with this. And I think everyone who is indicted, and I don't know who is going to be indicted, that's the prosecutor, who's an American, Clint Williamson, I think. I don't know him personally, I've never met him. But he's got a very good reputation, he's a man of integrity, he's well experienced. He would not reach any conclusion, his conclusions will not be political conclusions. His judgments will be judgments based upon the evidence that he has as an experienced prosecutor. But he will not be the judge. And the decision about who will be indicted is really up to the Europeans, I think. All he will do will make his recommendations about who will be indicted. Now, I hear stories about 400 people or large numbers, and I don't know the inside story on this. I really do not. My guess, though, for what it's worth, is that the numbers of people indicted will be less, significantly less than these rumors that we're hearing about 300, 400, 500 people, whatever. I don't believe that. I may be wrong, but I don't have any inside information, but I think it would be much less. Now, of course, there are rumors that there have been rumors from the beginning, as a result of the Marty report, that the Prime Minister might be included in an indictment. I personally do not think that he was involved in any organ trafficking, any of this business. It doesn't make any sense to me. But if he is indicted, I believe that whatever he may want to do, whatever he may think, he should go immediately to The Hague or wherever this tribunal is going to be located. Immediately. Sit down with them. I'm here to answer all of your questions. Go ahead. I like to have a lawyer present, of course, and immediately show that he's prepared to be cooperative. Kosovo cannot afford to be seen to be negative or hostile to this, or to be rejectionist about this. I don't see this as an effort to rewrite history or besmirch the reputation of the KLA or anything like this. I just think it's something that will have to be done, that people will have to take a decision that probably no one in Kosovo would want to do. They have to accept this. The indictees have to be sent to the tribunal. They have to follow the procedures, and the Prime Minister or whoever else, any senior people, they have to lead the way and be the model for the rest of the country to follow.
He was present in Parliament when this document was approved from the parliamentarians, and he was kind of supporting this process, even though that in Dick Martis he's the most attacked person. But I can say that most of the parliamentarians have declared that they were obliged from international community to vote for this. My question is, at which point Kosovo failed in its internal policy, so now we have to go through this very painful process?
War is a difficult business. For the internal process, this actually is an external process in a certain sense, of course, because it's driven entirely by the international community. And I think what it reflects is the belief by the international community that the rule of law has not been fully implemented within Kosovo. There's been a lot of progress on that, a lot of progress since June 1999, but it has not been full. And there is concern on the part of the internationals that a trial would not be fair, that there would be pressure from the political establishment to allow people to go free, that witnesses might be killed or feel that they would be under threat if they were to testify, and that a fair trial could not take place there. So again, the international community has reached that conclusion that a fair trial cannot be held in Kosovo because there would not be an impartial trial, and it would be really a political trial, and it wouldn't work. So that's why they've taken it into their own hands. Now that's their view of the rule of law in Kosovo, and I think it may be over-dramatized, and they may have misunderstood some of it, but frankly I think there is some truth in this, and the Kosovars have to understand that I would hope that the next government, whoever is chosen by the Kosovar people, will focus early on, whichever political party is uppermost in the cabinet and has the prime ministry and most of the ministers, that they focus on the rule of law. It's extremely important. And they have to read the international community right. They have to understand that the international community has made a judgment about the failure to establish a full rule of law within Kosovo. And I think the Kosovar people understand this too.
How important is for Kosovo to have its army, and in this case, what will happen to the NATO troops in Kosovo if Kosovo decides to have his armed force?
Why should Kosovo not be allowed to have its armed force? I think Kosovo needs to have an armed force. If they're not allowed to have their own armed force, then you're going to have irregular, for the former KLA then they will have to act as the de facto army. And so they will maintain a certain amount of readiness and so forth. It's a dangerous part of the world. It's a dangerous part of Europe. And the danger has been seen very recently, just in the last 15, 20 years. I think it's asking too much to expect the Kosovars not to have an army. I believe they should have an army. Now, but I also believe that the single most important thing to keep stability in the region involving Kosovo is that KFOR has to have, it's not just that KFOR has to stay there, it's that there has to be a serious American contingent within KFOR. KFOR without the Americans is not a credible force. We've seen that in Bosnia. When the Americans left, the force there, it's just no longer, it's not serious. And the Americans have to stay there. In fact, now it's just a few hundred troops. I actually think it's too low. And again, in view of what Putin is trying to do, and he has begun trying to stir things up in Kosovo as well. I've seen the media reports about these Russian so-called humanitarian NGOs or whatever that are in the north and maybe elsewhere stirring things up. I think that's very, very worrisome to me. But the Americans should have no less than 1,000 troops in KFOR all the time. It should be serious, a serious force. In that case, the KLA can only be the army, whether it's the KLA irregulars because they're not allowed to have an army, or an army. The army is something that, in my view, helps maintain the confidence of the Kosovars and their ability to defend themselves. But in case of a full-fledged war, a full war with Serbia, if you look at the size of the Serbian army and you look at the size of the potential Kosovar army, there's a real imbalance. And so it's a useful confidence-building measure to have an army, but only as long as there is KFOR and KFOR with the Americans. In that case, the confidence is useful. Without the Americans there's not really KFOR.
Another issue that I would like to tackle is this new phenomenon that Kosovo is facing of these groups, these extreme Islamic groups who are participating on the war in Syria. How serious do you see this problem for Kosovo and for the region?
I think it's very serious, and because almost every place that this has happened, when you get a contingent, and I think we're talking about a few dozen from Kosovo. Albania added more, but we're talking about just Kosovars now. I think it's less than 50, but I don't know the exact number myself. Ultimately, they will return home. Those who live will return home. And they will return home with a new vision, new skills, with a certain fire in their eyes, and they will be people that will be looking to inspire others to follow the path that they have followed. And I think this is very dangerous, because the Islam in Kosovo up to now, up until the last few years, has been very liberal, not anything that anyone would consider a threat, been very open toward a really great relationship with the West, and I think that's been terrific. It hasn't been a problem. It hasn't been an issue until the last few years. This will change. And what we've seen in other countries, and I spent a lot of time in my career in the State Department and then since in the NGO world in the Middle East and dealing with Middle East issues. And these things, people come home and that right away begins to change the political situation. You have terrorism threats begin to arise, they begin to agitate, they begin to create problems for, in this case, the Kosovo government. And I think they're going to be very difficult to keep control of, virtually impossible to keep control of when they get back home. They're really going to be a problem, I think, for the Kosovo people, for the Kosovo Security Service, certainly, for the Kosovo people, because they can jeopardize Kosovo's relationship with the West. They can shift the attitude of the West, which has not been one to see Kosovo as an Islamic extremist, jihadi type of country at all. Quite the contrary. It's perhaps the most pro-American country in Europe. This can change that, and that would be bad for Kosovo.
Mr. Hooper, thank you very much for the interview and for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you, my Linda. Thank you very much.